Resident Evil is turning 30 years old this year, and that goes without saying, but that is a huge milestone. Hell, this franchise is even older than me, and Resident Evil Requiem feels like the perfect celebration of the past 3 decades. Not in the sense that this is the absolute culmination of every single game in the franchise, nor is it a step forward into something new. Rather, it's a remix of some of the best moments and best things that people love about the series, tailoring itself to old fans and new alike. Now, of course, that doesn't encompass every kind of fan either. This is such a gargantuan series with such rich lore that it essentially means something different for everyone, kinda like Star Wars. And so, I don't mean that we've reverted back to tank controls or fixed camera angles, but I do mean that this game features a balance of the old traditional survivor horror elements with the action ones that we've seen in more recent mainline entries, bar 7 and Village. For the classic horror sections of the game, you play as an FBI investigation analyst, Grace Ashcroft, daughter of Alyssa Ashcroft from Resident Evil Outbreak. The more action-oriented sections, however, you play as Leon, which is to be expected considering he is a very well-experienced veteran at this point. And so the game will often switch between the protagonists, offering you 2 very different gameplay experiences that will complement each other and help break some of the potential dread and monotony. It definitely keeps things fresh. Because as Grace, you actually feel scared and terrified and trapped in this nightmare. Whereas with Leon, you feel like a god, mowing down hordes of enemies as if you're the face of death instead of them. And so that's why even though you have the option to toggle between first and third person for both characters at any time through the options menu, Capcom recommends playing in first person as Grace and third as Leon. And that's exactly how I did my first run, and feel that's the best way to experience it. And again, I do think that they cracked the code here on how to make Resident Evil feel scary again. They did it by reintroducing us to the traditional survival horror elements of puzzle solving, stealth mechanics, tight corridors, and scarce resources, along with the first person that they introduced in 7. That's why it works so well. Now, that's not to say that playing in third person isn't also a great experience worth trying, but to me, it definitely feels like the game was intended as such, with Grace as first and Leon as third. One of the things that this franchise keeps reminding me of is the lack of reusing characters, and Requiem only pushed that further. Now, don't get me wrong, I love Leon and Chris, but they are the only 2 that we see consistently, while everyone else sort of just gets sidelined. I mean, yeah, this is a game where we return to Raccoon City, the infamous city that played the most pivotal role in the series, so who better to include other than Leon? So yeah, fine. But there were others too, yet there is not even a single mention of Claire, Jill, or Ada. Aside from this one note mentioning Jill in the STARS office, that's all I saw anyway, and that's it. Sure, Sherry makes a return here too, and I love that she's here, but she too also gets sidelined by kinda just acting as Leon's handler. Plot-wise, it does make sense, but they also didn't have to go down that route. Again, I love Leon and Chris, but I would also love to see more games with our other previously established characters more in focus, rather than recycling these 2 and a new protagonist that inevitably falls off the face of the earth anyway. And yeah, I mean, what's the deal with that? Claire only occasionally shows up in some of the animated movies, but hasn't starred in her own game since 2015. Jill went MIA for years until suddenly reappearing in Death Island, and then you have characters who only appeared once, only to never be seen or heard from again, like Sheva, Carlos, Ashley, Helena, Billy, and Eminem, I'm not afraid, to name a few. And then there's literally everyone from Resident Evil Outbreak, who, yeah, I know, Alyssa is in this game, but we haven't seen her since 2003, and when they finally bring her back, they only bring her back to immediately kill her off. Oh, and Rebecca disappeared entirely too, again until Death Island, but Death Island is, for 1, an animated film, and 2, was set in 2015. So, correct me if I'm wrong, but that's the last time we've seen Jill, Rebecca, or Claire. So, Capcom, if you're listening, please start including your other legacy characters in new entries. Remake Code Veronica already, dammit. Grace is sent by her superior to return and investigate the hotel that she and her mother stayed at 8 years prior in 2018. This was also the hotel where Alyssa was murdered, so you can probably see how Grace must be feeling. She's riddled with anxiety and trauma, and returning to a place that still haunts you is no easy feat, hence the pure terror that you're about to experience. Meanwhile, Leon has come to investigate for his own reasons, namely to find a cure for the dormant modified Epsilon strain of the T-virus. The 2 briefly converge paths before splitting off again as Leon continues to race against time to stop it from spreading. But that's not before confronting his own past as well in Raccoon City. Resident Evil has never really been a series praised for storytelling. It's always meant to be on the sillier side, acting like those B-tier action movies in the late 90s and early 2000s, especially when we hit Resident Evil 4 onwards. But for what they are, they're usually pretty decent, and I'd say the same about this one too. The first half of the game, though, is far more interesting than the latter half, in both the gameplay and the storytelling. The first half of the game feels more grounded and mysterious and much heavier, but midway through, so much of that mystery and intrigue is taken away and kind of starts to teeter on the zanier territory yet again, which is fine, but is also just not nearly as interesting. The setup for the story with Grace, her mother, and all the mystery surrounding it is really quite interesting, and to pair that with Leon seemingly running out of time, it totally raises the stakes. But then as we approach the end of the game, it's still very enjoyable, but it does start to drag quite a bit, especially in the Raccoon City sections. And it's odd, because I think I was most excited to return to Raccoon City and see it in its current state and reminisce on what it used to be, and you'll find yourself certainly doing that, but they do end up designing the map to be much bigger than it needs to be. I think if you cut down this whole section of the game by like at least a third, it would largely improve the pacing. Again, it's still really enjoyable, but it did start to get a little long in the tooth. There also is another surprise I won't spoil, and as much as I love the addition of it, I also felt as though that was ironically short-lived, and would have wanted more of it instead of backtracking a ton in a much larger map than usual. It actually might have hidden things, come to think of it, and made it more interesting, but that's just me, and I'm probably just nitpicking at this point. Now, while still on the topic of story, let's talk spoilers, because I'm pretty sure some of you have at least beaten the game, if not platinumed and replayed it several times already, but if you haven't and you want to remain totally spoiler-free, skip here. In the first half of the game, like many other puzzle and adventure games, to progress to the next section, you need to find several keys or objects to open the door to that next main area. And so, in this game, you're scouting medallions. I can't quite recall what they're called, but yeah, basically medallions with a sun, a star, and a moon, and each one can be found in a cabinet somewhere in either wing. But in order to open said cabinet, you need to press down on buttons in the correct sequence, and 2 out of 3 of them have these symbols on them. You just have to figure out the correct order, which can be done by finding a photo in the room, which just happens to be conveniently taken where it's completed. And of those 2 cabinets, one of them also has Braille in addition to the moon, star, and sun. The third cabinet, however, does not. It only has Braille. So my first thought was, we had to backtrack to figure out what each symbol corresponds to and match them up. But nope, Grace decides to bring along Emily, knowing full well how risky and dangerous it is for both of them. Of course, this leads her to being taken and was done for plot convenience's sake, but if they didn't put Braille on those first set of buttons, then fine, it kinda would have made sense. But since they did, what is the point? Now, while still on the topic of spoilers, there is one thing I thought they were trying to do, in which I'm not entirely sure how I feel about it. In fact, I think I'm actually really mixed. So, there's a secondary antagonist called Zeno, and without a doubt, your first thought was probably, who is this guy and why does he look just like Wesker? Or better yet, what the hell, Wesker's alive? And yeah, honestly, for most of the game, I was convinced that he was secretly an older Wesker since we last saw him in Resident Evil 5, set in 2009, and so it's been a number of years, and I figured he somehow survived in some way by, like, Resident Evil's weird classic retcons, and survived because he was so mutated that a part of him lived or something. I have no idea. But for the longest time, I was convinced that Wesker had returned in some fashion, but I found it so strange that neither Leon nor Sherry could recognize him at all. So that kind of really did confuse me. But as it turns out, he really is just another guy who is, at the very least, trying to act like Wesker, I guess. Now, I think Capcom did this intentionally to throw us for a loop and subvert our expectations, but they also never had any of these characters suggest that he is Wesker, so I don't think I could blame anyone really but myself. But then again, the game does introduce the idea of cloning, and Grace herself being one, which becomes painfully clear the moment that you learn about the girls at the orphanage. And so that gets the gears turning, and seems like Capcom might actually be teasing the idea that Wesker had cloned himself Palpatine style.
Somehow Palpatine returned.
And Zeno is one himself, especially given that he has the same powers and everything. And to be honest, if that's not the case, what exactly is the point of this character? I mean, sure, Capcom loves introducing random one-offs, as we have discussed earlier, but how he's handled by the end? It's like he might as well have not have been in it at all. Unless they're teasing something for Resident Evil 10. Now really quickly, let me talk a little bit about the gameplay. And for the most part, it's largely the same as the others, except there's a few gameplay additions that I do feel like are worth mentioning. Firstly, the game does feel a lot more like a Naughty Dog game than some of the others. And not just in the way that they incorporated the weapon selections on the D-pad, but also the feel and the overall vibe. And many of the set pieces feel like they're heavily inspired by them as well. Like I could genuinely be fooled that I was playing The Last of Us. Especially, again, when you hit the derelict Raccoon City. It's got very similar vibes. And then with crafting, it's taken a slight step further. As Grace, you can inject blood splatter found on the floor with a blood collector and craft handgun ammo, hemolytic injectors, med injectors, and steroids. And the hemolytic injectors are especially cool because essentially they allow you to stealth take down some of the zombies. And it's even cooler when you're able to craft 3 of them, because then you can take out one of the bigger guys. The voice acting and performances I find to be generally heavily overlooked when discussing horror games. I think many a times people recognize they're well done, but rarely come up in conversation when putting up against others. In the last 2 years, Luke Roberts, who played James Sunderland in 2024's Silent Hill 2 remake, and Konatsu Kato, who played Hinako in last year's Silent Hill F, were both nominated for Best Performance at the Game Awards. And I thought that the performances were stellar, even more so than some of their competition, and their competition were all amazing themselves. Neither of them won, and that's fine. Winning awards really isn't that important. But I rarely heard about people praising the performances when discussing these games. And I think, and now I have no real evidence to back this up, it's conjecture, but I often feel like it gets overlooked because of how wooden some of the voice work had been in the past, especially with horror games, and especially with games like Resident Evil.
Well, let's split up and find another way off this oversized freezer.
Right.
Okay, let's do it.
Barry, where's Barry?
Well, I'm sorry, but he's probably...
No.
That's not the case here anymore, and I'm so glad. With Resident Evil, it's never needed to have excellent acting, given the type of series it is. I mean, this is a series about zombies and zombie-adjacent monsters with a new virus of the week created by evil scientist person who has either a direct or indirect connection with Umbrella and a boulder-punching Chris Redfield. But you go online and you see a lot of people praising this game for its performances, giving them their due flowers, and rightfully so. Angela Sant Albano did an incredible job as Grace. She showed genuine fear, and it's really rare to feel like you're playing as an actual, real, legitimate person who is riddled with anxiety and is totally out of their depth. And Angela is able to showcase a performance with real, genuine emotion, especially in moments of deep trauma. A trauma that carries through the character's entire arc, and nothing shows that better than her nervous stutter.
Who's there? What do I do?
Though at first, if I'm being honest, towards the end of my first playthrough, I did find it somewhat grating because at the beginning, it's not so bad and I understood it given the circumstances. But after a while, it began to feel like it was in every single sentence that she uttered. And that to me, initially felt unrealistic and overdone. That was until after I had beaten the game and really reflected on my time with it, and I realized something. Grace has such severe anxiety, it's crippling. After all, she's been pushed into a situation where there are zombies and all sorts of monsters lurking everywhere, and just generally feeling trapped into what feels like an inescapable nightmare. Unlike previous RE protagonists, she isn't immediately a badass who knows what to do or how to handle things. She's someone who's already riddled with past trauma and deep anxiety from the beginning, and to put her in a situation like this is only going to raise that tenfold. I mean, you can see that with how she clumsily drops her papers. Or better yet, in a flashback when she's glued to the screen, but reaching for her mother's hand for some level of comfort, reassurance, and safety. One that she later tries to provide for Emily, despite spiraling the whole time. But that's just it. Courage is not the absence of fear, but rather the assessment that something else is more important than fear. And Grace is the textbook definition of that. And then with Nick Apostolides returning as Leon for the 3rd time, or 4th if you count Infinite Darkness, he did a great job as always as well. But this time, it seemed like it must have been especially challenging, given that this is a Leon that we've never really seen before. It's a much older Leon, and previously, Nick only really needed to essentially replicate Neons we were already familiar with since they're remakes. But in Requiem, he's now 49 years old, and is much more jaded and gruff than he ever was. You can see that it's starting to really take a toll on him. I mean, he's still crazy skilled, but he's also heavier and slower than he was in Resident Evil 4, and even compared to when we last saw him in Resident Evil 6. Yet still, as rugged as he's become, he's still not one to shy away from his cheesy one-liners.
When's the last time you brushed your teeth? Should've worn a helmet.
I tested this game on both PS5 and PS5 Pro, and it runs perfectly smoothly on both machines, as expected. But I'm happy to report that the PS5 Pro does enhance the game by quite a large margin, and isn't somehow worse than the base model like some other recent games. Meaning the noise that would traditionally be surrounding the environment, peppering the foliage, is no longer present from my experience, and looks genuinely incredible on here. I won't say the base PS5 looks bad by any means, in fact, it looks great, but it's refreshing to notice an actual significant difference between the two platforms. Of course, it's not going to be anything night or day, as the PS5 Pro is the least significant mid-gen refresh compared to something like the PS4 to the PS4 Pro, but there is definitely enough here to stand out. And unfortunately, the captured footage here isn't really going to truly showcase what it looks like, as it's outputted to 1080p and further compressed on YouTube. But it should give you some idea of the differences. One of the most notable is the ray tracing and reflections. In the Pro version, while it's still unclear and doesn't quite live up to its PC counterpart, there are some level of reflections in the mirrors. The base model, however, does not seem to really include any reflections of the character models, though the objects in the background do appear, which is odd because they're non-existent in the Pro version, at least for the mirror. Not an expert on lighting and if this is more realistic given the draw distance, but it is something worth noting. But the cabinet here does have some of those reflections on the Pro and almost none on the base. Overall, the lighting does seem to perform better on the Pro, and all the textures look sharper and more refined, but I still do wish that we had more graphical modes to play with. But neither the Pro or, surprisingly, the base model have these options. But I do appreciate that it is at least a smooth and consistent 60 frames, and whether you're rocking the base model or the Pro, there's no doubt you won't be disappointed. While still on the topic of lighting, Capcom seems to have listened to the yellow paint criticism and did something interesting with it. Now, I'm not someone who's ever had an issue with the yellow paint, because while it's technically unrealistic to see paint plastered everywhere on top of every box, cliff, or interactive object, it definitely does help give the player visual cues to better understand what they can interact with in the environment and where they need to go. A lot of people do not agree with this and think it takes you out of the experience and significantly reduces immersion. But personally, while I don't always find myself needing it, it can be pretty handy, and the less time that I need to spend figuring out where the handholds are while climbing, the better. Again, a personal thing. And also, I do think that it definitely helps newer gamers a ton, as not everyone is instantly attuned to video game language. However, Capcom took a middle ground approach here that actually really works. Essentially what they did here was that they took that criticism and decided to still incorporate those visual cues, but more subtly. So now you won't be lost walking through corridors because you'll be guided by those lights, sometimes literally yellow. And instead of the yellow paint, they wrap ladders in yellow rope, which does make more sense contextually than imagining someone running around with a paintbrush in every level before you arrive. So where does Resident Evil actually sit in the pantheon of this 30-year-old giant? Honestly, it's a bit of a weird one, but in the best way possible. It's a game of two halves that shouldn't work together, yet somehow still do. You've got the suffocating, stuttering, sometimes genuinely scary horror of Grace's story, slammed right up against the slapstick horror action energy that Leon brings to the table. And sure, it's not a perfect game. Certain areas like Raccoon City have pacing issues, and it has a somewhat surprisingly simplistic story, and the plot convenience definitely did keep it from being a perfect 10. But, in my mind, at least, it's definitely up there for me, alongside 2 and 4, my favorites in the franchise. And Capcom, seriously, I am begging you, let Chris and Leon have a day off. Give us Jill, give us Claire, heck, give us Carlos or Eminem, anybody else. We know you have those character models. But even with those gripes, Requiem feels like a genuine thank you note to the fans. It's a remix that respects the roots, while acknowledging that, yeah, sometimes we just want to blow shit up as a 49-year-old jaded veteran. It's somewhat messy, incredibly nostalgic, and of course a bit over the top, but it wouldn't be Resident Evil if it wasn't.